Hey, beautiful women, how are you doing? Just popping back on live to continue the discussion today around boundaries and consent. I posted a written blog into the group yesterday, I think it was, around why it isn't always as simple as just saying no. And I was talking in that blog about my own experience just, was it last week or the week before, very recently anyway, of a very random, weird experience. It was on solstice of a stranger, a man that I stopped to give directions to. Everything was just going along really nicely. He was being friendly, I was being friendly, I was helping him get back onto the motorway that he wanted to get back onto to get home. And then out of the blue, like completely out of the blue, he asked for my number. I said no. And I was laughing as I gave him my number because it just seemed so ridiculous. Given our age difference, he was probably 20 years younger than me. Given our difference in status and the kind of person that we were obviously from very different worlds. So it just seemed absurd, really. And to be honest, like, there's no way in hell I would give my number to that person. But I was very happy to help them, right? And then all of a sudden, the conversation just took this turn out of nowhere, where he said something, and I'm not going to actually repeat it on camera, although I did write about it, something that was sexual, invasive, crude, vulgar, and quite aggressive. And it really took me by surprise. And then he drove off and then drove back again to give me his number and just say, if ever you want any fun, I'll drive down from London to see you. It didn't hit me at the time. My reaction was to laugh, actually, and it didn't hit me until some days later what had actually happened. And then I realized that was sexual harassment. And, you know, I feel really sad that as a 58, almost 59-year-old woman, I'm going to be 59 in September, right? This is something that I've been dealing with, that has been coming into my body, my life, my field since I was about 7 or 8 years old. And what has been coming into my field since that age, unwanted, uninvited words, touch, actions, thoughts, projections from men that are sexual in nature, that I've done nothing to invite, nothing to want, have not been thinking about, have just entered in without my permission, without my desire. So this invasion of my space, this crossing of my boundaries. And in this particular case, words that felt demeaning, diminishing, and violent in their imagery. So it's actually not a laughing matter, and yet, at the time, one of my primary reactions was to laugh. And when I wrote about this here on Facebook, actually, it was very interesting in that one man commented, and his comment was, so why, I can't remember exactly actually, but it was something like, so why did you laugh and why did you change your mind? So I guess what that suggests is that, and I can understand why actually, why somebody, a woman, laughing or smiling when something is happening could easily be interpreted as it's okay. But actually, laughing, smiling, not saying anything, going along with what is happening is a very common response, particularly amongst women, to something that they don't want, they didn't ask for, and they're not comfortable about. And why is that? So his question, although I felt when I read those words somewhat undermined and gaslighted, I guess it just simply reveals the lack of understanding of why this behavior can happen. So it's given me a wonderful opportunity to share and to educate and to research and to talk about this more deeply, because it's a real issue. Like I say over and over and over again, I haven't come across a woman in my life who has not experienced sexual harassment of some kind. Usually the typical statistic for the number of women in any group that I hold who have experienced sexual abuse, which is more serious, is about a third. And my research into kind of general statistics would bear that out. So it's an issue, this crossing of boundaries, and the sexualized crossing of boundaries, and the gendered crossing of boundaries. So how do we respond to that? And why do we respond in ways that seem to completely belie that what's happening to us is uncomfortable, we don't want it, we don't like it? Why then do we say nothing? Why then do we go silent? Why then don't we try to run away? Why then don't we shout? Why then don't we immediately highlight the nature of what's happening to us? And, you know, in my experience also, women tend to make themselves responsible, and women tend to judge themselves, and women tend to feel guilty or ashamed of their responses. And historically, I would say that the lack of understanding in the public domain, the lack of understanding in those who are supposed to be there to protect us and uphold the law, the sexism, the misogyny, the racism that exists still in public institutions haven't helped. So that's why this kind of question may have come up, or may still come up. Why didn't you just say no? Why didn't you just tell them to fuck off? Why didn't you just da-da-da-da-da-da? And of course, it's not that simple. So first of all, I just want to say, because I've asked into this group amongst you, you know, who has experienced sexual harassment, who has experienced sexual assault, and although some of you have answered, not all of you have answered, and I'm going to imagine that a lot of you have experienced this kind of thing. And you know, maybe questioning yourselves now about that, and or still processing the trauma of it. Because another thing I notice in holding space for women, where this is very common, is that there's a tendency to diminish the experience, almost to gaslight yourselves, or to spiritually bypass the impact upon you of what has happened. So even if you've done a lot of inner work or healing work and so on and so forth, it's going to have affected you in some way. And I'm not saying that in the sense of, you know, we all need to go around as victims, feeling that we're victims and, you know, we've had these horrible things done to us and woe is us. I don't mean it in that way at all. But the body remembers, as trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk says in his brilliant book, The Body Keeps the Score. And as an amazing woman, a heroine of mine, and I always get her name wrong, but her name is Dr. Valerie Rein, R-E-I-N, who wrote the amazing book, Patriarchal Stress Disorder, says every single woman on the planet has experienced the trauma, both in this lifetime and intergenerational trauma that is passed on through our DNA, of being subject to the subtle abuses of patriarchy, which persist and have persisted through the ages, through our family lines. And the flavor of that is the disrespect, the dishonoring, the lack of value for the feminine, her boundaries, her worth, her body, her sexuality, her heart, her love, all of that. And growing up in an environment where it has often not been safe, where these acts of crossing our boundaries, even our physical boundaries, has happened. So you may have seen a couple of my other lives that I've made into this group, where I spoke in one about how I lost a friend because I didn't hold my boundaries. And then in another more recent one where I spoke about how I lost a friend because I did hold my boundaries. So one of the reasons why we can go into fear around this is very real, which is that when we begin to speak up, when we begin to assert our yes or our no, not everyone around us is going to like it, particularly if we have been in the pattern of going along with things and being accommodating and being nice and being the people pleaser until now. If we begin to, and I was going to say stand up, but it's not even standing up. It's just being yourself and standing in your truth and honoring yourself and saying yes or no if that's true for you. Not everyone's going to like your yes and no. So part of us may be afraid to say no to something because we can be afraid of an angry reaction, a violent reaction, rejection, or a loss. So I've experienced loss through saying no and also through not saying no. Yes, please go back to the beginning. And watch the whole thing. So when we begin to step into the realm of, okay, I'm going to tune more into my boundaries now and consciously give or take away my consent and communicate my consent or my no and take responsibility for that, even though this is not something we've been educated in and not had modeled for us, most of us. Most of us come from education systems that taught us to obey authority and to shut up and be quiet and be good. Most of us were parented in a way where that happened too, and where our boundaries were constantly being crossed in different ways. And so we are not familiar very often with the understanding of what our boundaries are, what our rights and responsibilities are, and how to communicate in a healthy way. And fear can come up, particularly I always try to speak from my own life experience to give concrete examples. So, for example, when I, as a teenager, began to contradict my parents and ask questions, the response I got to that was physical or verbal violence and abuse. So it was physically dangerous for me to contradict or speak up, even though I have a brilliant mind, an inquiring mind. I love to ask questions. I love to find out. I went on to get a distinction in my master's degree and study for a PhD. So I've got a brilliant mind, a thinking mind, an inquiring mind, and a compassionate heart. And so it's natural to me to ask questions. But in my home environment, it was dangerous to question. And you know, prior to that, as a young girl, I was always questioning, always talking. I was a natural born leader, actually. And that quality in me was cracked down upon in my home and also at school, where you had to behave and follow the rules and, you know, only speak when you're spoken to or when you put your hand up. So we're conditioned into these patterns at home and in the education system too. Other ways that our boundaries can be overridden without us even realizing as children. I don't know if you have a memory. I have a memory of being made to kiss two uncles whenever we would see them. And one of them had a beard. And I really didn't like being made to kiss his face because he had a beard and I didn't like it. but also I just didn't like his energy and I would shrink away, but I was made to kiss him. Go on, don't be rude. Kiss uncle, da, 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 right? So that was, and then there was another uncle who would always take my ear and squeeze and twist my ear every time he saw us. And I didn't like it because it hurt and it would bring tears to my eyes. And yet again, everyone was just laughing and joking about it. So those are examples of how when we're young, our boundaries are overridden. We're not asked, we're not respected as separate individuals. And then this can create later on these patterns where we don't speak up because we got used to being helpless. It's kind of like a trained helplessness and lack of authority because we were children then. Do you remember that? Does anybody else have that kind of experience? And that's just small examples, but of course there are many, many more that we wouldn't have thought about at the time, but they go into the body memory. So fear can be real. This fear of rejection, the fear of anger, the fear of violence, the fear of loss can be reasons why we don't speak up. And then very strong reasons are, and I guess I'm already talking to this, social conditioning and trauma, and often they go together. So girls and women are socially conditioned to place their value upon being attractive and being desirable and being nice, being good, being wanted. So, of course, that conditioning to place that value outside ourselves, to be pleasing, to be appeasing, to be wanted, to be desirable, to be nice, to be liked. So then we may swallow our true feelings and our true thoughts out of fear of not being liked, not being wanted, not being desired if we say no, if we disagree, if we say what we really think, which is you're talking a load of shit, right? For example. So there's this social conditioning upon women and girls to be good, to fit in, to take care of people. And one way in which we take care of people is by taking care of their feelings. Oh, but what if they'll feel hurt? Well, sorry, but not sorry. My feelings, my needs, my desires come first. Honoring my needs, my boundaries and my limits comes first. Not at the expense of anybody else. Absolutely not. It is absolutely possible to be honoring of the self and the other. But we cannot actually truly honor and respect the other if we don't first honor and respect ourselves. If we're going into that kind of dynamic where we're putting everybody else first, it's another social conditioning for women to be martyrs, right? To put everyone else first. That's not healthy. That's a codependent, people-pleasing, dysfunctional dynamic. It's a way we've learned to get love by people-pleasing. We think our value and our love comes from being a martyr, and that is not true love. That is not true service. No. So trauma and conditioning. So that's part of the conditioning, and then the trauma. Well, as we know statistically, but also experientially, most women on this planet have experienced at least one, but probably a lot more than one instance of sexual harassment where usually a man speaks inappropriately, looks them up and down, wolf whistles, makes them feel uncomfortable, stands too close. All of these are examples of sexual harassment, right? Or assault, which is when inappropriate touch is involved. So that is traumatizing. That is traumatizing to the body, to the mind, to the emotions, to the spirit. And what is a typical trauma response? Well, it's summarized in all the literature as the 4 Fs: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. You probably know the first 3. The 4th one isn't necessarily always so well known. Fawning is being accommodating, being appeasing, being nice, smiling, in the face of perceived danger. So let's take fight or flight. Well, if you're a boxer or an athlete, maybe you will choose those. Perhaps if you've got a very feisty character, you might choose those. However, generally speaking, if you're a woman in the presence of a man, you're not going to choose to fight because he'll win, and you're not going to choose to run because you might imagine he'll be able to outrun you. And again, this is speaking generally. I know there are some very strong and fit women and some very weak men, right? However, just generally speaking, that's our programming, and that's what we perceive, and that's what we've experienced. So we're not going to run and we're not going to fight, although we may fight verbally and take that risk. Because fighting isn't just about fisticuffs, it can also be about speaking in a very aggressive way or defensive way. So what are the more common response patterns for women when they go into a trauma response? It is to freeze, which means to go numb, to not move, to feel unable to move, to feel stuck, and to fawn. Oh, that's okay, right? Do you recognize that in yourself? I certainly do. And it comes up and I find myself doing it. Much as I really don't want to be, I still do it. It's understandable. My dad smacked me around the face if I disagreed with him. It was dangerous to do that. So smiling and laughing can be a defense mechanism that I learned to survive, to take care of myself so as not to incur any more violence or shouting, verbal abuse, being told I was stupid, to shut up, right? Those kinds of things. So fight, flight, freeze, or fawn are trauma responses. And it's really good to know this, to have compassion for ourselves as well as for other people. Because sometimes we really can't read body language and we really can't know what's going on for the other person. And they might not be able to tell us in that moment. So these are some of the reasons why it's not necessarily as simple as just saying no, even though inside you could be screaming inside silently. Inside, every part of you could be saying, I want to get out of here, I want to get out of here. Inside, every part of you could be saying, stop, get off, but the words don't come out. This is researched, so this isn't just my experience, although my experience counts for a lot. I've been holding space for women for 20 years, and I have my own experiences of sexual harassment, sexual assault, attempted rape, narcissistic abuse, right? But I have educated myself. I've done the research and read a lot, studied a lot, taken a lot of workshops, still learning, still studying, still researching. So you're not to blame if you didn't say no. You're not to blame if you went silent. You're not to blame if you couldn't do anything. And the person who says to you, why didn't you just do that? Doesn't understand. And that can be experienced as a form of gaslighting, which is where you're made to doubt and question yourself. You're made to doubt and question your experience by somebody. So don't let yourself be gaslighted. Trust your knowing. You know what happened. But this is why it isn't always as easy to just say no. Parenting and education, we live sadly in a world and a system that is still very authoritarian, that does not teach us and encourage us to individuate. So healthy parenting encourages children to individuate, which means to grow up, and as you get older, to gradually develop your own sovereign consciousness, your own sense of separation from mother and father, your own mind, your own thoughts, your own values, your own beliefs, your own desires, your own trajectory, not to be projected upon or forced into something because that's what everyone thinks you should do or should think, right? So healthy maturation is to be individuated, to be separate, to be sovereign, to know who you are and who they are, to think for yourself, to act for yourself. That's healthy, but most parenting and education does not encourage that and does not educate us about that. So we don't know this until we do. So again, another pattern for women that is more common is to tolerate and endure. You know, I teach sacred sexuality, healthy relating, embodied awakening. All of this goes hand in hand. My first sexual experiences, which if you read my book, Rapture, I talk about, not in a salacious way. You know, I can just suddenly kind of hear some response from somebody. I'm like, oh, just grow up, you know. It's like to understand. So my first sexual experiences were boring, not particularly pleasurable. I tolerated, I endured. Did I say anything? No. It would not have occurred to me as an innocent, inexperienced teenage girl. It just wasn't in my realm of possibilities at that time in my life to know that I could say stop, that I could say no, that I could say I don't like that, but I do like this. It just didn't occur to me because my conditioning from the family, from the education system, from the culture, which was incredibly patriarchal and misogynistic. Remember, I was born in 1964. Just would not have occurred to me. There are things that we take for granted and we think are normal that are not normal. So misogyny and patriarchy have been normalized. It is not normal to have things done to you that you don't like and don't want and to say nothing. It is not normal for men to feel entitled to abuse or invade or cross your boundaries in any way. It is not normal. They are as socialized into that as we are socialized into the opposite. So it's not about blaming anyone. This is part of the patriarchal conditioning. Tolerating and enduring. So how do we shift this? How do we change this? How do we heal from this? Well, it's not an instant thing. It's a slow burn change, but one of the many ways is by educating ourselves and beginning to practice new skills and new ways of being. I'm still doing it now. And sad to say, at 58, almost 59, I'm still experiencing sexual harassment frequently. So we practice, we learn, we educate ourselves first of all, and that's what my upcoming mini course is about. So the course is called Just Say No, even though I know it's not as simple as just saying no, where I share with you the fundamental principles of boundaries and consent, rights and responsibilities, what's mine, what's yours, how to communicate authentically, how to tune into your body's knowing and wisdom to really determine what your needs and what your desires are and what your boundaries and limits are, and to practice that in a safe environment. Practicing in a safe environment first is really, really helpful and important. And from the first round that I've done of this workshop, I can say that there are always revelations that the women have, which is like, oh my God, you mean I can say that? Oh my God, you mean I've been caretaking my partner all these years? Oh my God, you mean it's okay for me to just say no and not have to explain myself? Yes. So the response I've gotten from my work around this is that there's a huge need for us to educate ourselves first and foremost about boundaries and consent, and about conscious communication, and about embodied awareness, because all of these skills come from being in our bodies, sensing what our inner experience is, so that we can then communicate that. But it starts with being in tune with yourself before you then even have the capacity to say anything. And then practicing that. So my workshop, Just Say No, the next one is September, the next one is July the 22nd, is about this. So that's one way we can help ourselves come to my workshop, read a book. There are so many great books that can help you. There are so many other great teachers about this. Begin to challenge people and begin to challenge the system in ways that feel safe for you. So don't put yourself in unsafe situations, but if and when you do feel safe, begin to practice no longer smiling and laughing when you don't really mean it. No longer staying in situations that don't feel comfortable the minute they don't feel comfortable. Finding a few sentences that you can try out in real life situations to extricate yourself from situations where you feel your boundaries are being overridden. Try it out. Be prepared for friends and family, or some friends and family, to not like it, and don't take it personally. Because it's not personal. They're just, if somebody reacts to you honoring your boundaries and communicating that in a clear and conscious way, that's just their own stuff getting triggered. It's got nothing to do with you. It's their own stuff. So begin to challenge, begin to walk the path of commitment to your own well-being, to your own honoring, to holding your own boundaries, because ultimately it does come down to taking responsibility for yourself fully and completely. You are not a victim. You may have been a victim in the past, but you are not a victim now. You are responsible. So part of that responsibility is educating yourself, changing your behavior where you can, as much as you can, and speaking up, speaking out, naming it. You know, things stay the same until we name them and illuminate them. Nothing's going to change. We don't need to be mean. We don't need to point the finger. We don't, unless, well, actually, I'll come back to that in a minute. We don't need to blame other people. We don't need to turn this into a rant, but just beginning to not turn a blind eye to when this happens to you or when this happens to somebody else. When somebody tells you something that's happened to them, listen, don't gaslight them, and just hold space for them to share. That's all they need, is the space to be heard, and that in itself is validating. So they don't need fixing. They don't need to be asked some gaslighting question like, why didn't you do this? Oh, maybe he just, you know, that's already gaslighting. Oh, maybe making light of it. Listen and take seriously and validate. I hear that you experienced this. How did it make you feel? How do you feel now? What do you need? How can I support you? Right. Because the thing is, right, the men who do this, they have partners or sisters or mothers or aunts or grandmothers. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. So we are, this is my perspective, we are all responsible. So I speak up because I want things to change. And sometimes it means, you know, I get flack. I get people projecting onto me. I get people gaslighting me, and I don't like it. But to me, it's also worth it because I want things to change. And if we keep turning a blind eye, if we don't highlight, if we don't call people out, if we don't name it, it's never going to change. And in a way, we are just complicit with a system that continues to be misogynistic. How do we educate our children? Like, I've educated my children. I've got a son and a daughter around these issues. My daughter's got rock solid boundaries. She's amazing. She's 19. She's got rock solid boundaries. I'm so proud of her. My son, amazing young man, respects women, knows how to communicate. Amazing young man. So I've played my part in that, you know. That's part of the change, is how we educate the next generation, how we parent our children. But also, do we let things slide when we notice our brother, our mate, talking in a way that isn't appropriate, treating somebody else in a way that isn't appropriate? At work, same thing. And again, I really get how fear can come up in that environment. I also experienced harassment at work, and I did bring it up, and I was threatened with being sacked. So, you know, I've come up against that in that environment too. So I understand. It's not always easy, right? Choose your battles, choose them wisely. Don't judge yourself if you don't feel ready for it. Get support, get information. There are a lot of charities and volunteer organizations out there that can help and support you. Speak to someone. One final thought I want to add on this one is that often we isolate ourselves out of shame. We don't mention it to our friends out of shame. Again, that's a conditioned trauma response. So choose who you share with, but know that the minute you share, it's not locked in your body system anymore. And there can come a great relief and a great release through sharing in a safe way with trusted people. That's helpful, that's supportive. We all need to look out for each other here, sisters. We all need to look out for one another here. If you're in a public space, and I've done this many times because I'm not afraid in that sense, or I wasn't, if I see something happening that I feel is inappropriate, I will step in, I will speak up. Don't do that. That's not okay. What are you doing? Stop. You know, I don't live in London anymore, but traveling on the underground there, people are just so numbed out and just sitting there on their phones and ignoring what's going on. Don't numb out. Wake up and say no. So I hope this has been helpful in some way. If you want to join my next live Just Say No workshop, it's just for women at this point. It's coming up on Saturday, July the 22nd, 10 a.m. in the morning till 1 p.m. in the afternoon. That's UK time. You can find the info in this group, and I will also post the information below in the comments, or you can message me to find out more. So I really hope those who need to hear this message and those who can and want to can join me then. Lots of love, everybody. Thanks for watching. Namaste.